A cold winter morning in New York City. Colin Powell sits in the UN Security Council chamber, adjusting his glasses as he reaches for a small glass vial. What Powell doesn't know is that this moment, this single prop in his carefully choreographed presentation, will become the symbol of America's most catastrophic foreign policy blunder in generations. A mistake with consequences that will reverberate across 7 countries and cost nearly 1 million lives. The man holding that vial happens to be one of the most respected figures in American foreign policy, a former general whose credibility spans decades. But Colin Powell isn't just delivering another diplomatic speech. He's selling a war that will unleash chaos across an entire region, destroy ancient civilizations, and create the largest refugee crisis since World War II. Years earlier, in the aftermath of September, a small group of men gather in the West Wing. They call themselves advocates for democracy. History will remember them as the architects of destabilization. George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz, these 4 names will become synonymous with a foreign policy doctrine that fundamentally reshapes how America projects power. What they don't realize is that their grand strategy of preemptive intervention will create a domino effect of regional collapse that continues today. The numbers tell a staggering story that few Americans fully comprehend. Since then, the United States has spent over trillions on Middle Eastern interventions, resulted in thousands of American military deaths, and contributed to the displacement of millions of refugees across the region. But these figures only scratch the surface of a much deeper transformation. Less than a month after the Twin Towers fall, American bombs begin raining down on Afghanistan. The mission seems straightforward: find Osama bin Laden, destroy Al-Qaeda, punish the Taliban. What Bush and his advisors don't anticipate is that this temporary military action will become America's longest war, a decades-long commitment that costs trillions and achieves virtually none of its original objectives. The Afghanistan invasion establishes a dangerous precedent. For the first time in American history, the doctrine of preemptive war becomes official policy. We cannot defend America and our friends by hoping for the best, Bush declares at West Point. If we wait for threats to fully materialize, we will have waited too long. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a different kind of planning takes shape. In the Pentagon, Paul Wolfowitz and his deputy Scooter Libby draft what becomes known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, a blueprint for maintaining American global dominance through unilateral military action. The document, leaked to the New York Times but revived after the attacks, envisions a world where America prevents any rival from achieving regional power. Bush delivers his State of the Union address, coining a phrase that will haunt American foreign policy for decades: the axis of evil. Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, 3 countries that pose, according to Bush, an existential threat to American security. But what the American public doesn't know is that Iraq has already been selected as the next target, regardless of its connection to the attacks. The intelligence community raises red flags early. CIA Director George Tenet later reveals that the agency repeatedly warned the Bush administration about the absence of credible evidence linking Saddam Hussein to weapons of mass destruction. We were almost all wrong, David Kay, the former top U.S. weapons inspector, will later tell Congress. But Dick Cheney has a different agenda. The vice president, working with a parallel intelligence operation run through the Pentagon, systematically manipulates intelligence reports to support a predetermined conclusion. Iraq has to pay a price for what happened yesterday, Richard Pearl tells Tenet, despite knowing that Iraq had no involvement in the attacks. This brings us back to that vial in Powell's hand. The Secretary of State, privately skeptical about the war, agrees to make the case to the United Nations after intense pressure from Cheney and Bush. Powell spends days at CIA headquarters in Langley, reviewing intelligence reports that he later describes as a blot on his record. The cascade begins: Iraq's collapse and regional fragmentation, Shock and awe begins with precision strikes on Baghdad. Weeks later, American forces topple Saddam Hussein's statue in Firdos Square. Bush declares mission accomplished from the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. What happens next transforms the entire Middle East. L. Paul Bremer III makes two decisions that will haunt Iraq for generations. First, he disbands the Iraqi army, sending well-armed men into the streets with no jobs and deep resentment. Second, he purges all Ba'ath Party members from government positions, eliminating institutional knowledge and creating a power vacuum. The consequences unfold with devastating precision. Al-Qaeda in Iraq emerges under Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, targeting Shiite holy sites and sparking sectarian warfare. The Samarra shrine bombing unleashes waves of ethnic cleansing that kill hundreds of thousands. Iraq, once a secular bulwark against Iranian influence, becomes Tehran's closest ally in the Arab world. Iran's ascension represents one of America's greatest strategic failures. The removal of Saddam Hussein eliminates Iran's primary regional rival and opens a corridor of influence stretching from Tehran to Beirut. Iranian-backed militias proliferate across Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, creating what Israeli officials call a ring of fire around their borders. The contagion spreads: Libya, Syria, and the Arab Spring. The pattern repeats itself with tragic consistency. As the Arab Spring reaches Libya, Barack Obama orders NATO airstrikes against Muammar Gaddafi's forces. The intervention, sold as humanitarian protection, quickly escalates into regime change. Gaddafi falls, but Libya descends into permanent civil war. Obama later calls the failure to plan for post-Gaddafi Libya the worst mistake of his presidency. But the damage extends far beyond Libya's borders. Weapons flow from Gaddafi's arsenals across the Sahel, fueling conflicts in Mali, Chad, and beyond. ISIS establishes a foothold in Libya that persists for years. Syria presents the most complex challenge. When Bashar al-Assad's government violently suppresses pro-democracy protests, Obama calls for regime change. Assad must go becomes the official American position, but when Assad crosses Obama's declared red line by using chemical weapons, the president blinks. The credibility gap proves devastating. Assad, backed by Iran and Russia, escalates his campaign against Syrian civilians. Over hundreds of thousands of Syrians die in the resulting civil war, with millions forced from their homes. ISIS fills the vacuum, conquering territory across Syria and Iraq. The human toll, refugees, and regional collapse. The numbers are staggering. Since American interventions began, they have contributed to the deaths of nearly 1 million civilians across the Middle East. More than tens of millions of people have been displaced from their homes, creating refugee flows that destabilize neighboring countries and fuel political crises across Europe. Afghanistan demonstrates the futility of nation building through military force. After 2 decades and trillions of dollars, the Taliban returns to power, erasing virtually all American gains. Women are once again banned from schools and workplaces. Public executions resume. Opium production rebounds despite international pressure. Yemen represents perhaps the most tragic example of intervention's unintended consequences. When Saudi Arabia launches its war against Houthis, the United States provides intelligence, weapons, and logistical support. The result is what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with hundreds of thousands of civilians dead and most of the population dependent on aid. The supreme irony of American intervention becomes clear when examining its strategic outcomes. Every major U.S. objective has been reversed. Iran, designated as part of the axis of evil, now dominates Iraq, influences Syria, arms Hezbollah in Lebanon, and supports Houthis in Yemen. China and Russia expand their influence in regions where American credibility has collapsed. The financial costs continue to mount. Linda Bilmes, a Harvard economist, estimates the true cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars at over $6 trillion when including veteran care and interest payments. That's approximately $20,000 for every American citizen. More fundamentally, the interventions have undermined the international order that America spent decades building. The doctrine of preemptive war, once uniquely American, has been adopted by Russia in Georgia and Ukraine, by China in the South China Sea, and by regional powers across the Middle East. Barack Obama inherits Bush's wars, but expands them in new directions. The drone program, virtually non-existent under Bush, escalates dramatically under Obama. Between 2009 and 2017, the United States conducts drone strikes across Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen, 10 times more than Bush's total. The targeted killing program creates new problems. Each drone strike generates local resentment and recruits for extremist groups. The killing of American citizen Anwar al-Awlaki in 2011 raises constitutional questions that remain unresolved. Obama's Terror Tuesday meetings, where he personally approves assassination targets, normalize extrajudicial killing as a tool of statecraft. As we enter 2025, the Middle East remains convulsed by conflicts that trace their origins to American interventions.